I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear.
William's chair moved before anyone at the table could stop him. One moment, the royal dinner had been moving through the careful rhythm of polite conversation. The next, the atmosphere had fractured. Camilla had made a pointed remark about Catherine, and William's expression changed so sharply that even those who had heard countless royal disagreements could have sensed something deeper was happening. He was not reacting as though he had simply heard an unkind comment about his wife. He looked as though a private boundary had just been crossed. And that is where the mystery begins. According to the speculative accounts surrounding this story, Camilla's words appeared to touch on Catherine's future role and influence inside the monarchy. What made them so unsettling was not merely the criticism, it was the impression that Camilla knew something William had not expected her to know. If that interpretation was correct, then the dinner had suddenly become something far more serious than a family disagreement. Before the evening could settle, William appeared to want one answer. Why had Catherine's future been discussed in that way, and who had already been talking about it? If you were sitting at that table and discovered your wife's future had been discussed without you, would you stay silent or demand an answer? Hi viewers, if William's position was being undermined in a conversation involving Catherine, then standing by and saying nothing would mean allowing the same secrecy to continue. So if you believe a husband deserves to know when a major decision about his family is being discussed behind his back, leave a simple comment saying he deserved to know. And if you want these royal controversies examined instead of brushed aside, subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who follows the royal family. Back at the table, nobody seemed eager to move. Glasses remained where they had been placed. Conversation had lost its easy rhythm. Catherine stayed composed, but the restraint only sharpened the discomfort. Camilla appeared to recognize that her remark had landed differently from how she intended, yet the damage was already done. William was no longer listening for an explanation about manners. He was listening for a clue. A casual criticism could have been dismissed. Families argue, relatives make observations. People say things at dinners that sound harsher than intended. But the alleged comment carried another possibility. It seemed to suggest that Catherine's growing position had already been examined in private, perhaps by people who believed they had the authority to discuss what her future should look like. William's attention shifted from Camilla to the rest of the table. That movement said more than an outburst could have said. He was not simply asking whether Camilla had gone too far. He appeared to be wondering whether she had accidentally revealed the existence of a conversation that was never meant to reach him. And that is precisely where the tension around this story becomes difficult to ignore. Camilla then appeared to soften the point. The suggestion was that the comment should not be treated as an attack. It could have been a remark about Catherine's public position. It could even have been an awkward attempt to discuss the future without intending to reveal anything sensitive. But William seemed unconvinced. For William, that sequence could create an uncomfortable thought. If there was nothing behind the remark, why did it sound as though Camilla was speaking from knowledge rather than speculation? No verified public record establishes that such a dinner conversation occurred exactly as described, and the alleged details remain part of royal commentary and speculation. But that uncertainty is also what gives the story its central question. The issue is not whether every whispered detail can be proven. The issue is what the remark seemed to imply within the narrative. William appeared to want the implication confronted. Who had discussed Catherine? What had been discussed? And why did Camilla sound as though she already knew the answer? Catherine remained remarkably controlled. There was no dramatic retaliation, no attempt to turn the room against Camilla. Her restraint created another layer of tension because it left William carrying the visible anger, while she appeared determined not to make the situation worse. He looked toward Camilla again. The question had changed. It was no longer simply, "Why would you say that?" It had become, "Who told you?" That was the moment the evening appeared to move toward its real conflict. Because if Camilla had merely offered an opinion, the matter could end with an apology. But if her words had come from an earlier conversation, then William was facing a different problem entirely. Someone may have discussed Catherine's future. Someone may have considered what her role should become. And according to the speculative interpretation driving this story, William may have been the one person who was not fully informed. That possibility would explain why the comment appeared to affect him so deeply. It was not simply about Catherine. It was about trust. It was about family. And it was about whether decisions concerning the future had begun moving through private conversations before everyone who mattered had been brought into them. The room remained quiet. Camilla had another chance to explain. William was waiting. Catherine was watching. And somewhere inside that silence was the question that could turn one uncomfortable dinner remark into a much larger royal controversy. What exactly had already been discussed about Catherine before William heard it at that table? Because if Camilla had accidentally revealed more than she intended, the most explosive part of the evening had not happened yet. The real revelation was still waiting behind one unanswered question. Who knew first? The question followed William long after the first exchange had ended. Who knew first? It was a simple question, but inside the royal family, simple questions can carry uncomfortable weight. Catherine's future was not an ordinary family matter. Every adjustment to her public responsibilities could affect how the monarchy presented itself, how the next generation was prepared, and how the public understood the line of succession. That was why Camilla's comment, at least within the speculative accounts surrounding this story, seemed to strike William differently from an ordinary criticism. Catherine had become one of the most closely watched members of the royal family. Her appearances were analyzed, her speeches examined, her clothing discussed, and even her smallest gestures could become part of a larger conversation about the future. With William beside her, she was increasingly seen as central to the monarchy's next chapter, and that growing influence was exactly what made the alleged remark so sensitive. Catherine was not simply another member of the family whose schedule could be changed without consequence. Her position carried a title, a history, and an expectation that extended far beyond any single dinner. The role of Princess of Wales had always attracted intense attention because of the women who had carried it before her. Every public appearance could be interpreted through that history. William knew that better than almost anyone. So when Camilla appeared to speak with unusual certainty about Catherine's future, William's concern was not necessarily that someone had expressed an opinion. It was the possibility that the opinion had come from somewhere else. Perhaps Camilla was simply speculating. Perhaps she was repeating something she had heard, or perhaps, as the more dramatic interpretation suggests, she was referring to a conversation that had already taken place among senior figures. There is no verified public evidence establishing that a secret decision was made behind William's back, and that distinction matters. The story rests on speculation surrounding the meaning of the alleged remark, not on a confirmed palace document or public announcement. Yet the question remains compelling because the royal family has always operated within layers of private discussion that the public rarely sees. The audience sees the announcement. The family sees the conversations before the announcement. That difference is where the mystery lives. At the dinner, William appeared to be trying to work out which side of that line Camilla's comment belonged to. Camilla understood that world too. She had spent years living under public scrutiny herself. Her own journey into the center of the monarchy had involved intense media attention, difficult comparisons, and a complicated public relationship with the royal institution. She knew that words spoken in private could acquire an entirely different meaning once they reached the public. That made the alleged comment even more intriguing. If Camilla was simply offering an observation about Catherine, why frame it in a way that seemed connected to Catherine's future? And if she was speaking about a future arrangement, why mention it at dinner? Those questions would have been difficult enough under ordinary circumstances, but the presence of William made them more personal. William was not merely Catherine's husband, he was the heir to the throne. Any conversation involving Catherine's future role would naturally intersect with his own future responsibilities. A discussion about her influence could therefore become a discussion about the future king and queen together. That is why the possibility of exclusion would matter so much. Imagine discovering that someone close to the family had already discussed a major aspect of your future with other senior figures, only to hear an indirect reference to it later over dinner. Even without any secret plot, the discovery could feel like a breach of trust. And that appeared to be the emotional territory William had entered. His anger was no longer just about the words, it was about what the words might reveal. Catherine, meanwhile, remained difficult to read. Her silence could have meant many things. She might have wanted to prevent the disagreement from escalating. She might have believed the comment did not deserve a public response. She might simply have understood that any emotional reaction would give the controversy another life beyond the dinner table. Whatever the reason, her restraint changed the dynamic. William was confronting the issue. Catherine was absorbing it. Camilla was explaining it, and Charles was left watching a conversation about the monarchy's future turn unexpectedly inward. That was the point where an ordinary dinner could become something much more revealing. William's question about who knew first, therefore, carried more weight than it appeared to. If nobody else knew, then Camilla had simply made an unfortunate comment. If several people knew, then the situation was different. And if Catherine's future had already been discussed among senior members of the family, the obvious question would be why William had not been told. That was the possibility hanging over the table. No confirmed evidence proves that such a private decision existed, but within the narrative, that uncertainty becomes the very thing that keeps the tension alive. The audience is left examining every pause, every explanation, and every attempt to move the conversation somewhere safer. Camilla's next response would matter, not because it could prove a secret, but because it could reveal whether there was something behind the comment that she had not intended to expose. William was waiting there for clarity. Catherine was still silent, and the longer the explanation took, the harder it became to believe that the original remark had been completely harmless. Then came the detail that changed the question again. Camilla appeared to know more about Catherine's future than William expected. That did not prove a hidden decision, but it created a possibility that William could not easily dismiss. And once that possibility entered the room, the dinner was no longer really about what Camilla had said, it was about what she might have known. That was the difference between an awkward family exchange and a potential royal fault line. And the next question would force that fault line open even further. William did not let the question disappear. Who knew first? It was the question that kept pulling the conversation back toward the uncomfortable point Camilla had tried to explain away. The original comment could have been dismissed as careless. It could have been misunderstood. It could have been nothing more than a poorly chosen observation about Catherine and the demands of royal life. But William seemed to be looking beyond the words themselves. He wanted to know what had produced them. Camilla was now in a difficult position. Any attempt to explain the remark risked giving it greater importance. If she insisted that it meant nothing, William could still ask why she had spoken with such apparent certainty. If she admitted that the subject had been discussed before, another question immediately followed. Who had been involved? That was the pressure building around the table. Charles remained measured, but the atmosphere had changed. A conversation that had supposedly been about Catherine's place within the monarchy was now becoming a discussion about trust between family members. and that distinction mattered because the royal family does not operate like an ordinary household. Public roles, private relationships, succession, reputation, and institutional expectations are constantly intertwined. Catherine understood that better than most. For years, she had lived under a level of attention that made ordinary mistakes difficult to hide. A single photograph could become a headline. A public appearance could generate speculation about her health, her marriage, her responsibilities, or her relationship with other members of the family. Yet she had generally maintained a controlled public presence, allowing speculation to pass without answering every accusation. That history made the alleged dinner exchange particularly sensitive. If Catherine had spent years being watched and interpreted by the public, the last thing she needed was for the people closest to her to begin defining her future without her husband knowing. Again, there is no verified evidence establishing that such a secret arrangement existed. The possibility comes from the speculative interpretation of the alleged conversation, but within that interpretation, William's reaction makes sense for a very specific reason. He was not asking whether Catherine deserved a bigger role. He was asking whether somebody else had already decided what that role should be. Those are very different questions. Camilla appeared to understand the distinction. Her explanation shifted toward the broader pressures surrounding the monarchy. Catherine's growing popularity, the public's expectations, the importance of the next generation, the need for stability, all of those subjects were plausible topics for a royal family discussing its future. But William's concern remained fixed. Why had the conversation sounded personal? Why had Camilla referred to Catherine in a way that suggested prior knowledge, and why had the subject surfaced now? The more the discussion moved around those questions, the more obvious the central problem became. An answer about the monarchy could not fully answer a question about trust. William then appeared to press the issue more directly. If the remark was simply an opinion, then there should have been nothing complicated about explaining it. But if it reflected something Camilla had heard privately, then the situation changed. The room seemed to reach that uncomfortable place where everyone understands the question, but nobody wants to be the person who answers it. Catherine remained quiet. That silence was important. She did not appear to encourage William's confrontation, at least within the speculative account. Nor did she publicly challenge Camilla. Instead, she allowed the discussion to unfold while keeping herself outside the argument. That restraint created an unusual contrast. William was becoming increasingly determined to understand what had happened. Catherine was refusing to make the moment larger. Camilla was trying to contain the implications, and Charles appeared to be watching the disagreement develop into something that could easily become much more damaging if handled badly. Then William asked the question that shifted everything. Had this been discussed before? For a moment, the answer seemed almost secondary. It was the reaction that mattered. A pause can say more than an explanation when someone is already suspicious. If Camilla immediately denied knowing anything, the matter might have ended there. If she explained exactly what she meant, William could have judged the explanation for himself. But hesitation creates another possibility. Was she simply choosing her words carefully? Was she trying not to embarrass anyone? Or had William accidentally touched upon something that other people already knew? None of those possibilities can be established as fact from the available account. Yet they explain why the alleged exchange becomes so compelling as royal commentary. The dinner was no longer centered on Catherine's personality. It was centered on information. Who had it? When did they receive it? And why had William apparently not been part of the conversation? That final question carried the greatest emotional weight. William and Catherine were being presented as central figures in the monarchy's future. If discussions about Catherine's responsibilities were taking place, it would be reasonable to expect William to be involved in decisions directly affecting their shared public role. A failure to communicate could therefore feel like more than an oversight. It could feel personal, and that was where the alleged confrontation began, moving from irritation toward something resembling betrayal. Camilla could have ended the tension by making one clear statement. Instead, the conversation remained surrounded by qualifications and explanations. The more complicated the explanation became, the more William seemed convinced that there was something beneath it. Then another possibility entered the room. Perhaps the issue was not that Camilla had been told about a specific decision. Perhaps she had heard a broader discussion about Catherine's future and repeated part of it without realizing how revealing the remark would sound. That possibility was less explosive, but it still left William facing the same uncomfortable reality. People had apparently been discussing Catherine's future, and he wanted to know who they were. The tension became impossible to ignore. Catherine finally looked toward William. There was no need for a dramatic gesture. The meaning was already clear. William had reached a point where an ordinary apology would not satisfy him. He needed clarity. And if Camilla could not provide it, someone else at the table would have to. That was when Charles became central to the confrontation. As king and as William's father, Charles occupied the unique position of being both family member and head of the institution whose future was being discussed. Any disagreement involving Catherine's future therefore had implications beyond the personal. Charles could calm the room. He could dismiss the speculation, or he could acknowledge that conversations about Catherine's future had indeed taken place. The next words from him would determine whether the dinner ended as an awkward family disagreement or became something far more revealing. William waited. Camilla said nothing. Catherine remained composed, and for the first time that evening, the possibility hanging over the table was impossible to ignore. What if William's anger was not caused by what Camilla had said? What if it was caused by what her comment had accidentally revealed? Because if that was true, then the real confrontation had only just begun. Charles finally broke the silence, but his response did not settle the matter. It only made the room more cautious. The conversation had reached a point where every explanation carried another implication. William wanted to know whether Catherine's future had been discussed. Camilla appeared to want the entire subject treated as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Catherine remained composed, giving little indication of what she was thinking. And Charles, caught between his role as William's father and his responsibility for the institution, had to decide how much of the conversation should be allowed to continue. That was the danger. Because once a family argument touches the future of the monarchy, it stops being entirely private. William seemed to understand that. His concern was no longer simply emotional. He wanted a direct answer about whether there had been an earlier conversation concerning Catherine and the responsibilities that might eventually come with her position. Camilla's explanation, however, still left room for doubt. She could point to public expectations. She could talk about Catherine's growing importance. She could explain that senior members of the family naturally discussed the future. None of that would have been extraordinary. But William's question was more precise. Had anyone already discussed a specific change involving Catherine? That was the question that could not be comfortably buried beneath general statements about royal duty. The room seemed to narrow around it. Catherine's silence now carried a different weight. She had spent years watching public speculation build around her without responding to every rumor. She knew better than most that reacting to every accusation only created more headlines, yet this was not a newspaper story. This was a conversation involving the people who would help determine the future she was expected to serve. If the alleged discussion had happened, Catherine would eventually be affected by it. If it had not happened, William wanted the misunderstanding destroyed immediately. Either way, someone had to clarify the situation. Charles appeared to recognize that. Within the speculative narrative, his position was particularly complicated. He could not simply dismiss William's concern as anger. William was not an outsider questioning palace decisions. He was the heir and Catherine's husband. Any serious discussion about Catherine's future responsibilities would naturally overlap with William's own position. That was why the possibility of him being excluded felt so significant. It would not necessarily mean that anyone was plotting against him. It could have been nothing more sinister than a preliminary conversation, an informal suggestion, or a discussion that had never reached the stage of a formal decision. But William did not know that. All he had was Camilla's comment, and the impression that it contained knowledge she should not necessarily have possessed. That impression was enough to keep the confrontation alive. Then came another uncomfortable realization. Perhaps the alleged secret was not a finished decision at all. Perhaps there had only been a discussion about how Catherine might eventually become more influential within the monarchy. That distinction mattered. The public often sees royal announcements as sudden developments, but major institutional changes rarely emerge from nowhere. Responsibilities evolve. Public expectations change. Senior figures discuss possibilities. Plans are considered and reconsidered long before anything becomes official. That meant Camilla could theoretically have heard something without knowing that it would ever happen. Yet William's reaction remained understandable within the story. The issue was communication. If something concerning Catherine had been discussed, why had he not heard about it directly? That question brought the conversation back to trust. William had spent years beside Catherine, while both faced relentless scrutiny. Their public roles were intertwined, their future responsibilities connected, and their family increasingly associated with the monarchy's next generation. So discovering information indirectly could feel like being deliberately kept outside a conversation that directly concerned him. That was the emotional wound beneath the anger. Not simply exclusion from information, exclusion from his own family's future. Camilla appeared to recognize that the conversation was becoming too serious to continue casually. Any further attempt to minimize the comment could make the situation worse. Yet openly acknowledging a prior discussion could create another problem. What had actually been said? Who had said it? And who had been present? Those questions now hovered behind every word. William appeared to notice something else. Nobody was volunteering names. That silence became its own form of evidence within the narrative, although it could not establish that any secret agreement existed. People can remain silent for countless reasons. They can be uncomfortable. They can fear escalation. They can simply refuse to discuss private family matters. But William was looking for certainty. Instead, he was receiving caution. That was when his frustration appeared to harden. The story was no longer about whether Camilla had insulted Catherine. It had become an examination of how information moved through the royal family. And that was where the alleged dinner took its most intriguing turn. If Camilla had learned about Catherine's future from another senior figure, then someone had chosen to have that conversation. If she had heard it casually, then someone had spoken more freely than expected. And if she had been involved in the discussion herself, then William had an even greater reason to ask why he had not been informed. None of those possibilities can be presented as confirmed fact, but they explain why the dinner, as described in this speculative account, became so tense. The uncertainty itself became the problem. William wanted a clear line between what was known and what was merely being imagined. Instead, the conversation seemed to remain suspended between the two. Catherine eventually appeared to recognize that the argument was approaching a point where no useful answer could come from continuing it in front of everyone. Her restraint once again became significant. She did not appear eager to turn the disagreement into a public family rupture. She had too much experience with the consequences of royal conflict becoming entertainment for the outside world. But William was not ready to let the central question disappear. He looked toward Camilla again. The question was no longer complicated. Had she heard this before? Camilla's response, within the alleged account, still did not provide the clean certainty William wanted. And that was the moment the original remark acquired an entirely different meaning. Perhaps Camilla had simply spoken carelessly, perhaps she had repeated a general discussion, or perhaps, without realizing it, she had revealed that Catherine's future had already become a subject of private consideration among senior members of the family. That last possibility was the one William could not easily dismiss. Because if Catherine's future had already been discussed, then another question followed immediately. Who had been part of that discussion? The answer mattered, but there was an even more disturbing possibility. What if William had not been the only person left outside it? What if Catherine herself had also been unaware of what was being considered? That possibility changed the emotional stakes completely. The conversation was no longer simply about whether William had been excluded. It raised the possibility that Catherine's future had been discussed around her rather than with her. And if that were true, the alleged dinner comment had done something nobody at the table seemed prepared for. It had opened the door to a much larger question about who was actually making decisions about the next stage of the monarchy. William had started the evening reacting to one comment. He was now confronting an uncertainty that could not be dismissed with a simple apology. And just when the room seemed ready to move on, one final detail threatened to pull the entire conversation apart. The issue was not merely what Camilla had said, it was the timing. Why had she said it that night? Why had Catherine's future become the subject at precisely that dinner? And why did her wording sound, at least within the speculative account, less like a prediction and more like something already known? That was the detail William could not shake, because an opinion can be invented in a moment. Knowledge usually cannot. And if Camilla's words had come from knowledge rather than opinion, then the question waiting at the end of the dinner was no longer whether William had overreacted, it was whether someone had already been preparing for Catherine's next role without telling him. The answer remained hidden, but the possibility was now sitting at the table with them. The dinner should have ended there. An apology could have been offered. A misunderstanding could have been blamed on careless wording. The family could have returned to safer conversation and allowed the uncomfortable moment to disappear behind closed doors. But William was no longer focused on the remark itself. He was focused on the silence surrounding it. That was the detail that stayed with him. The alleged comment had opened a door, and once that door was open, every explanation seemed to lead to another question. If Camilla had simply been expressing an opinion, why had the subject sounded so specific? If she had only been repeating what the public already believed, why had William reacted as though something private had suddenly entered the conversation? And if there really had been an earlier discussion about Catherine's future, why had William apparently learned about it indirectly? Those questions transformed the atmosphere. Catherine remained composed, but the emotional weight of the evening was impossible to ignore. She had become the center of a dispute she had not appeared to initiate. Her future role was being discussed around her, while William was trying to determine whether anyone had already decided something without the couple being fully informed. The most dramatic interpretation of the story suggests that Camilla's comment may have exposed a conversation that was never supposed to become obvious at the dinner table, but there is no verified public evidence establishing such a secret decision, and that distinction remains important. What can be examined is the logic of the alleged exchange and why the suggestion of hidden discussions would have been so explosive. For William, the issue would not simply be whether Catherine received greater responsibility. He would want to know how that responsibility was being determined. Royal roles are rarely created in a vacuum. They evolve through discussions about public expectations, institutional needs, family responsibilities, and the demands placed on individual members. That means a conversation about Catherine's future would not automatically indicate wrongdoing or betrayal. But timing matters. So does communication. And if William genuinely believed he had been left outside an important discussion, his anger would have been about more than the future itself. It would have been about trust. That is where the story's central mystery becomes much more powerful than the original confrontation. Perhaps Camilla had simply spoken too freely. Perhaps she had heard a suggestion and repeated it without realizing how it would sound. Perhaps several senior figures had discussed Catherine's growing importance without reaching any final decision. Or perhaps the comment reflected a conversation that had already gone further than William knew. There is no public evidence that allows those possibilities to be settled as fact, but one possibility remained impossible to ignore within the narrative. Someone had apparently been thinking about Catherine's future, and William wanted to know who. The question had now moved beyond Camilla. It pointed toward the wider royal circle. If another senior figure had spoken to Camilla, then that person became relevant. If Camilla had formed the opinion herself, then William needed to understand why she had expressed it with such confidence. If the discussion had involved Charles, then the implications became even more sensitive because Charles's position placed him at the center of decisions concerning the monarchy's long-term direction. That was why the final moments of the dinner carried such tension. No one needed to raise a voice. No one needed to make a dramatic threat. The unanswered questions were doing the work themselves. William had begun the evening hearing a comment about Catherine. He ended it wondering whether the comment had revealed something about the people around him. That difference was enormous. And Catherine's response made it even more striking. She did not appear to seize the opportunity to turn the disagreement against Camilla. She did not need to. Her composure allowed the focus to remain where William believed it belonged, on the information, on the timing, on the possibility that something had been discussed privately. That restraint also exposed an uncomfortable irony. The more everyone tried to explain the alleged comment, the more attention it received. The more they attempted to make it sound ordinary, the more William seemed to question why it had been said at all. Eventually, the dinner had to move toward its conclusion. The conversation weakened. People became more careful with their words. The warmth that had existed earlier in the evening did not return in the same way. And yet there was no definitive public confrontation that could neatly close the story. That is what makes the final question so persistent. If William had received a direct explanation that completely satisfied him, the matter would have ended with an awkward exchange. But the story does not end that way. It ends with uncertainty. And uncertainty can be more powerful than an accusation because it leaves the audience searching for the missing piece. What exactly had Camilla known? Who had spoken to her? Was Catherine's future genuinely being discussed behind closed doors? And if it was, why did William appear to be the last person to discover that conversation? Those questions cannot be answered simply by assuming the most dramatic explanation. They require caution. The royal family is surrounded by speculation, and every ambiguous remark can be transformed into a story far larger than the original event. That is precisely why the distinction between confirmed information and interpretation matters, yet the emotional core remains easy to understand. A person can forgive a criticism. A person can forgive an awkward remark. A person can even forgive someone for speaking without thinking. What becomes much harder to forgive is the feeling that important information was deliberately withheld. That is what appears to sit beneath William's reaction in this story. The alleged comment may have been the spark. The real fire was the possibility of exclusion, and that is why the title's description of William going into a furious reaction carries more meaning than simple temper. The anger, within this speculative account, is connected to a deeper fear that Catherine's future was being discussed in rooms where he was not present. If that interpretation is wrong, then the entire confrontation could be reduced to a painful misunderstanding. But if it is even partly right, then Camilla may have done something far more consequential than make an unfortunate remark. She may have revealed that conversations about Catherine's future were already happening. And that possibility leads directly back to the question William could not answer that night. Who knew first? That question is still more powerful than the argument itself, because if Camilla knew before William, there had to be a reason she knew. Someone could have told her. She could have heard a discussion. She could have drawn her own conclusion, or the entire remark could have been nothing more than an unfortunate interpretation of an ordinary family conversation. Those possibilities remain open, but the reason the story continues to attract attention is simple. William's reaction suggests within the narrative that he believed there was more beneath the surface, and sometimes the most revealing moment in a royal controversy is not the accusation, it is the moment someone asks a question and nobody gives a straight answer. That is what turned the dinner from an uncomfortable family gathering into a mystery. The alleged disagreement began with Catherine. It moved toward William. Then it reached Camilla. But ultimately, it pointed toward something much larger. Who gets to discuss the future of the monarchy? Who gets to influence Catherine's role? Who is included in those conversations? And who can be left outside them? Those are the questions that remain after the dinner ends. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. Maybe Camilla never intended to expose anything. Maybe William misunderstood the remark. Maybe there was no secret decision waiting behind the conversation. But if there was something more, then one careless sentence may have revealed what months of careful royal messaging never could, that Catherine's future may already have been a subject of serious private discussion. And William's fury may have come from realizing that the conversation had started without him. So the final mystery is not whether Camilla upset William. The mystery is whether she accidentally told him something he was never supposed to hear. If you believe that a family should be honest with the people whose future is directly affected, then this is where viewers have to decide for themselves. Was William right to demand answers, or did the entire confrontation grow from one misunderstood comment? Leave that opinion in the comments. And if you believe royal stories should not simply stop at the headline, subscribe, like, and share this video. Because sometimes the most important part of a royal controversy is not what was said aloud, it is what everyone suddenly stopped saying. And on that night, the question remained hanging in the air. Who knew first?